Our hearing will resume with Mr. Heinrich, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our guests for being here today. I have one question I want to direct first at Mr. Coll, and then feel free, the rest of you, to chime in as well. But I wanted to ask you, Mr. Coll, one of the fundamental limiting factors to our success in Afghanistan, which is obviously related to this whole issue in a deep way, is it's just the willingness of the Afghan government to do some of the fundamental reforms, the anti-corruption measures and other things that are necessary. And I wanted to get your, as somebody who's written about many of these players in Afghanistan for a long time, I wanted to get your take on how you would characterize the willingness of the Karzai government today to make some of the changes that we need to see to realize our goals in Afghanistan.
Well, all the evidence is that it's inadequate, and it's certainly one of the major strategic risks facing U.S. policy in Afghanistan. Having said that, the better news is that the Afghan government is larger than President Karzai. I've long worried about the extent to which, out of necessity and expediency both, we've tended to make him an indispensable figure and run everything through his office. You see now in the relationship between Parliament and the President the potential for a sounder, more broadly based approach to the limited role that the Kabul government actually has to play. But it is important because of the credibility that it provides for international policy in Afghanistan. And I recognize as well that General McChrystal and Ambassador Eichenberry and others have a vision that is based on the idea that there are many more actors in Afghanistan who can turn things around than those just in the Kabul ministries. So working through effective governors and at the provincial and even sub-provincial level will be critical to achieving the sort of stability that will allow Afghan security forces to deploy and U.S. forces to pull back.
Congressman, just to piggyback, I think it's a very good point. With relation to that, I think a big question that the Afghan government has and that our policy confronts is the question of the center versus the locality. How much we rely on local and tribal partners in the first instance versus the focus on Kabul and the central government. And in particular, from a security perspective, whether or not we begin to rely more heavily on local security militias. I think that becomes a very important policy question for not only folks here in Washington, but also in Kabul. You've had experiments that have worked well in Wardak province and other places, but it's not clear that model will work everywhere in Afghanistan, and we've got to be careful about diffusing the security of the country. And so I think there's some very important inflection points here with respect to Kabul's ability to control its own security.
As a follow-up question, are there opportunities that we're missing to engage the wider government, the broader government, that we should be taking advantage of to make sure that all our eggs aren't in that Kabul basket?
I think it's critical that U.S. policy in Afghanistan approach these political equations with as much energy and creativity and resources as it is approaching the military equation. And I think you've described it, framed it correctly, which is that a successful policy of national reconciliation and political reintegration that complements the security piece in Afghanistan over the next 3 to 5 years has to be more broadly based than the presidential palace. You can achieve that broader base through lots of different mechanisms. You can turn to Parliament. You can use Loya Jirgas and other institutions, traditional institutions. You can do it regionally as well as nationally, but you have to do it. And it has to also be reinforced by regional diplomacy that brings to bear pressure on these factions in Afghanistan that are otherwise not likely to participate in such a reconciliation program. And I think there's always been an articulation of this vision in U.S. policy, but now bringing it to bear successfully, it's hard, it's going to be a zigzag, it's always going to be incomplete, but if it's not made a priority, then it won't succeed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank the gentleman, Mr. Credible.
Mr. Chairman, first let me thank you for allowing folks to come back so we had an opportunity to ask a few questions. Let me just follow up on Mr. Heinrich's question. His question sort of went to the issue of how do we make that policy in Afghanistan better. My question's a little bit different. Given the facts related to this Christmas Day incident, and given what we know is going on in Yemen and the problems there, what impact does that have on your view of the strategy at all in Afghanistan in terms of putting more troops on the ground? Any of you, or all of you?
It has no impact on my view in the sense that I think that, as I believe it was Mr. Clarke pointed out, the understanding that there were problems outside of the Pakistan-Afghan region predated the Christmas attack, and robust activity was underway, just wasn't publicized. I think the reason that the President made the right decision in Afghanistan has to do with core Al-Qaeda, which, as we talked about earlier, remains resilient and, while under pressure and diminished, still able to facilitate the transfer of bomb-making techniques, still able to participate in robust media operations, and still able to assist the destabilization of both the Pakistan and Afghan governments. And so it's a resilient danger that needs to be addressed directly, and I think that that's the rationale ultimately for the policy in Afghanistan.
I think Steve's right. They're very different situations, and they call for different kinds of responses. In Afghanistan, things obviously got out of control, and we therefore now need a very large military force there, at least for the short term. In Yemen, we're able to work through an existing government, give it military support, give it intelligence support, and hopefully give it development, economic support. There will be other places around the world where Al-Qaeda will pop its head up, or affiliated groups will pop their heads up. And at least initially, these small footprint solutions, like what we're doing in Yemen, are the appropriate response.
Congressman, the only thing I would add, and I would agree with both my colleagues here, is that there's a demonstration effect to our policy. And so shifting the momentum of the Taliban in Afghanistan becomes important in terms of the global posture that the U.S. has, in part for our friends and allies, as they understand we are resolute and are willing to fight for what we believe in and to work with them. That becomes very important with Pakistan, I think, in the long term. And I also think in terms of the enemy, becomes important. We don't want to play into their hands, and we don't want to needlessly spend blood or treasure. But at the same time, we need to be resolute. And I think one of the lessons of Iraq is that it was one of the first times that we had, when bloodied, stood up to Al-Qaeda and surged. And I think that was a devastating lesson to our enemies. And I think that's something we should keep in mind in Afghanistan.
We had testimony several months ago, and I'm trying to remember the gentleman's name, but in talking about the Afghanistan, what we're going to do in Afghanistan, and his point was, of course, if we're squeezing in one place, it would bleed out into another. One of you mentioned what's happened in Yemen as a result of the crackdown in Saudi Arabia. Can't we simply expect that to happen based on the crackdown in Afghanistan?
Well, the government of Pakistan is certainly concerned about spillover effects. Their version of what's happened after 9/11 emphasizes the consequences to Pakistan of the migration of Al-Qaeda from Afghanistan into Pakistan as a result of U.S. military action there. But I think my response to that argument that you referred to, which has been part of a very healthy American discourse about U.S. policy choices in Afghanistan, this notion that you squeeze the balloon and Yemen pops up and Somalia pops up, is that there's no territory that means to Al-Qaeda what the Afghan-Pakistan border means to Al-Qaeda. And the role of the core leadership and networks that are located there is distinct from any other expression. That doesn't mean these other expressions aren't dangerous. But in order to achieve any definition of success against Al-Qaeda, that core organization needs to be disabled and destroyed. And I do think it's a distinct problem.
I would disagree. I would say that Al-Qaeda core will make their last stand in the Afghan-Pak border region. You're not likely to see a grand Al-Qaeda caravan to some other locale the way we saw, for example, the move from Sudan to Afghanistan in the past. That doesn't mean the regional affiliates or radicalized cells and individuals won't be a problem in the future. They will. But it doesn't mean that there's the balloon effect that people talk about.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Let me ask Mr. Clarke, we've had some homegrown domestic radicalization. A fellow named Zazi, the Major Hassan, a fellow named David Headley, and then the Northern Virginia Five. What do you make of this? Turn that on, please. Yeah.
I think it's remarkable we don't have more. And when you think of it, we're a nation of 300 million people. And there have clearly been attempts by Al-Qaeda and similar groups to radicalize populations in the United States, including prison populations. And so far, I think we've done a fairly good job in the United States on both the ideological front and the intelligence front. What I mean by that is I think the American Muslim community, or communities, I should say, have been very good in waging the ideological war within their own communities against Al-Qaeda and against what it believes in. And we've been very successful. And it's been remarkably different in Europe. If you look at England, you look at Germany, you look at France, those Islamic communities have been more successfully radicalized than those in the United States. I think it's logical to expect that this is going to happen. We're going to have these onesies and twosies of people, individuals who are radicalized, in part through internet outreach, radicalization on the web, at least initially, and in part through the occasional radical imam like Al-Awlaki, who has now moved to Yemen but was in Northern Virginia and elsewhere. I think it's largely, though, sir, Mr. Chairman, I think it's a good news story that so little of it has happened and that the FBI has done a relatively good job in tracking what problems there have been here.
Thank you. Any comments from the other two gentlemen?
Mr. Chairman, I would just repeat what I said in my testimony, which is I don't think we should overreact in terms of the number of cases we've seen over the past year. I think we've seen a fairly consistent element of a domestic radicalization problem that hasn't reached a crisis or tipping point, as Dick mentions. You've had Derek Sharif, SNL Siddiqui, the Fort Dix plot, the Torrance cell. Over the last 8 years, we've had numerous cases where the FBI and others have done very good work in disrupting. So I don't think we should make any grand conclusions. Two things we should watch, though, is the clustering, the fact that you have groups of individuals within communities, like the American Somalis, that are drawn to the ideology. And secondly, the continued attempts to reach the foreign terrorist organizations themselves. And I think that is a bit different in kind that we need. That's the kind of thing we need to watch very carefully, because that presents a different kind of danger than the onesies, twosies that Mr. Clarke talked about.
Thank you, Mr. Coll. Well, gentlemen, this has been an excellent hearing, and we certainly appreciate your being with us, and we feel that we've learned a great deal, and we look forward to seeing you again. Okay.